Hello and welcome to the BookTube channel, Jack in the Book Stack, where I talk about a wide variety of book genres and the bookish lifestyle. Today, we are doing a reading vlog for Don Quixote, which is one book. I just have 3 editions of it here. But when 2024 started, I had the goal of reading 6 classics and doing really in-depth reads, annotating them, analyzing them, really kind of chewing on how I felt about these books that are well-known classics. I've done one of these reads and videos already. That was for Madame Bovary, which I ended up rating 5 stars, really surprised by the book, and enjoyed the whole process of that. So I will link that video down below for you so you can check it out after this one. But let's start talking about the book of the moment, Don Quixote. Don Quixote by Cervantes is known for being about the impractical pursuit of idealistic goals. This is about an aging knight who has been misled by the romance novels that he has read. The main lesson in this book, or so I hear, is that one must live life in a genuine, passionate way regardless of what others may think. I am not exaggerating when I tell you I am super excited to read this book and share the experience with you. I started researching it last night, just some of the background of the book, and tried to set my expectations, and I fell into this rabbit hole of research that has me so hyped to read this, and there's so much I want to talk about, so much I can't wait to find out for myself. But some key facts that I found that I screenshot to tell you. So the genre of this book, I mean, it's a classic, but it's a parody, comedy, romance, morality novel. The point of view, Cervantes narrates most of the novel's action in third person, following Don Quixote's actions and only occasionally entering into the thoughts of his characters. He switches into first person, however, whenever he discusses the novel itself or the Benengali's original manuscript. The tone, Cervantes maintains an ironic distance from the characters and events in the novel, discussing them at times with mock seriousness, which will be interesting if I can pick up on that, because usually I'm very literal. It's written in past tense with some moments of present tense. It is set in Spain in 1614. This is translated from Spanish, and in my research I saw one comment that says that this book did for the Spanish language what William Shakespeare did for the English language. So Cervantes did some massive work here. For a little bit more detail about what the book is actually about, here is the synopsis from GoodReads. It says that Don Quixote has become so entranced by reading chivalric romances that he determines to become a knight-errant himself. In the company of his faithful squire, Sancho Panza, his exploits blossom in all sorts of wonderful ways. While Quixote's fancy often leads him astray, he tilts at windmills, imagining them to be giants. Sancho acquires cunning. Sane madman and a wise fool, they roam the world together, and together they have haunted readers' imaginations for nearly 400 years. With its experimental form and literary playfulness, Don Quixote has been generally recognized as the first modern novel. This is the edition that I'm going to be reading and annotating. This is the Penguin Black edition. It is just short of 1,000 pages, and the font is really dense and really small. So this might be a little bit difficult, but this is what I'm going to be annotating. I also have the Penguin Clothbound edition, which I adore, and I was thinking about reading this one, but the font is of equal smallness. So actually, it seems kind of crazy, but I might read my Easton Press edition of it, even though it is huge. Like, look at the size difference here between these books. But the font is a little bit bigger, and there are some illustrations at some various points, which I think could add a lot to the read. So I might switch back and forth. I haven't quite decided. I will go with wherever the vibe takes me, but this is the one that you are going to see the annotations in. My first exposure to Don Quixote was actually through the children's show Wishbone, when he did a little bit of a skit on this. If you're not familiar with the with the show. It was on like Channel 8, PBS, and it was about a Jack Russell Terrier who, there was two timelines or views. This Jack Russell Terrier in his everyday life, and he narrates it, and then he would reenact a classic novel. And he did this one, and so I just remember it being such a charming story. And one of the biggest takeaways I had from that is that this is a story about a book lover. And that has stuck with me. That's what I really want to experience. So while I was researching this book and the themes and the different things I might want to annotate, everywhere I looked had an emphasis on literature as like a main theme or an element of this book, which I loved. And so something I found is that, here is a snippet here I'll read to you from SparkNotes. It says that Don Quixote contains several discussions about the relative merits of different types of literature, including fiction and historical literature. Most of the characters, including the priest and the canon of Toledo, ultimately maintain that literature should tell the truth. Several even propose that the government should practice censorship to prevent evil falsehoods of certain books from corrupting innocent minds like Don Quixote's. However, we see that even the true histories of the novel end up disclosing falsehoods. Cervantes declares that Don Quixote itself is not fiction, but a translation of a historical account. The fact that we know that this claim of Cervantes is false, since the work is fictional, makes Cervantes' symbolism clear. No matter how truthful a writer's intentions may be, he or she can never tell the whole truth. Despite these inherent flaws, however, literature remains a powerful force in the novel, guiding the lives of many of the characters, especially Don Quixote. Notions of authorship and storytelling preoccupy the characters throughout the novel, since many of them consider the idea of writing their own histories as their own narrators. So that is definitely something that intrigued me about this book, and that I will be keeping an eye out for this read, among some other things. Interestingly enough, recently I posted a reel how I annotated a Stephen King novel, The Stand, and I got a couple comments that seemed to be really confused why I would annotate a book. So before I dive into the strategy of how I'm going to use these tabs to mark up this book, I want to just touch on why I annotate. And it's not always classics. I do it with different books, different genres, but it really helps me engage with my reading experience on a deeper level. For classics specifically, I want to know why they are classics. I like reading these alongside SparkNotes or lit charts or some kind of guide that helps me see things, identify things that I wouldn't have otherwise. So it deepens my read. And by annotating it, by writing in the book or by tagging it, not only am I keeping track of my reactions and my emotions and my personal opinions, but I'm flagging things from these other sources that are part of the reasons why the books have stood the test of time, or were so well known, or were so controversial. Many times it's because the books are so much older. In our society, things might not be controversial today as they were like in this time period. So reading alongside SparkNotes and lit charts really helps me with that. But annotating, it's kind of like a fun way to engage, like a scavenger hunt almost. It's just so satisfying to go through and do it, and I get a deeper experience with the book. And then imagine when I reread it and I see all these thoughts that I had before, all these things I had researched or had reactions to, it makes the book more sentimental as well. And that also deepens my experience with the book. So that's why I annotate. So let's go ahead and let's talk about how I'm going to annotate Don Quixote by Cervantes. I mentioned that I love having a companion to read classics. So for Don Quixote, I am using lit charts. I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with SparkNotes, as it gives me spoilers when I'm reading the summaries alongside my own personal read of the book. So I'm going to try lit charts. Now here is an example. It does much of the same things. It breaks down the different themes that are identified in the book. And researching this website is also how I determine what I want to annotate. But here is the theme of literature, realism, and idealism. I said literature was something that I wanted to keep an eye on for this read, so that's why I'm picking this one. And I'm not going to read through all of this because I don't want to give myself spoilers. So I'm going to scan through that. But look how cool this tracker is. So this is the theme tracker, and it shows where and to what degree the theme of literature, realism, and idealism appears in each chapter. So this is super neat. I think this will be really helpful. The gray is the chapter length, and this purpley blue color is how prevalent the theme is. So this is going to be a great companion for my read to be sure that I am capturing the full extent of the themes in my read so I can get the most out of it. I think this is such a cool analytics view to add to this experience. After doing all this research, here is how I decided I wanted to annotate my read. So I am going to use these pink tabs for moments and quotes that I love, which is something I always annotate. For these two colors, which when they're off of the card and on the pages, they look like the same color, this is going to indicate character moments, like the introductions, the descriptions, and also breakthrough moments for our character development. For the blue tabs, I want to annotate emotions. So I said that this book is humorous, so I want to tab moments that I find funny, perhaps that I find sad, or also where I'm questioning our character's sanity. I thought that could be kind of fun, kind of an emotional reaction, I suppose. For these purple tabs, which also look the same in the pages of the book, I'm going to do the themes. And there was a lot of information on lit charts and also spark notes of different themes, but I decided to go with literature, realism, and idealism, as I showed, and also intention versus consequence, because this is something that I often think about in my everyday life, intention versus outcome. So I want to keep an eye out for that in this read. So I am fully set up. I'm ready to get reading. As if 3 editions of the same book were not enough options, I also got the audiobook that I can listen to if I want to. It's 40 hours long, and I'm not sure if it's the same translation, so it might be difficult to listen while annotating this translation. I've found issues with that in the past, and also if I'm listening to it, it's going to be harder to annotate and find the spot in the book. So I don't know if I will use this that often, but hey, it's an option. I made a last-minute decision. So the orange color I didn't have a category for, so I decided to make that the indicator of insanity. So I'm using it to tag here. I originally had that for the blue, but I was thinking about it. That's not really an emotion that's evoked in me. That's the character description. So I'm gonna use orange for insanity, and there might be some crossover here with like realism and idealism, but you know what? It's not that serious. I'm just gonna add in that color for my annotations. I made it to page 70 in Don Quixote. I thought this was a great place to do a little bit of an update because I'm at a break. There's a second part of the ingenious Hidalgo, Don Quixote de la Mancha. So a little bit of a break there, so I thought I could tell you a little bit. So I love it. I was right. This is absolutely hilarious. We have this older man, he's in his 50s, and he has been reading lots of books about knights, and so he has decided that he wants to go be one. And so this is pretty much him getting set up. He has this really old horse that is now his steed, And that in itself is funny because this horse is like not into the whole situation. And Don Quixote has like his armor all set up and his lance. And it's so funny because he goes to this inn and he takes off some of his stuff, but he can't get his like helmet off. So he's just wearing this helmet and like trying to eat with it. And it's funny because people kind of laugh at them, but then they just kind of humor him a little bit. And in his different missions and his different ideals of what chivalry is. And we did meet his squire, Sancho Panza. So he has just met him and convinced him to follow him along, promised him all these riches. Like, this poor gullible man, he might be as gullible as Don Quixote. I don't really know. But it is pretty cute. It's pretty charming. It is very easy language to understand in general. However, when Don Quixote is speaking, because he thinks he's this knight, he speaks a certain way, and that language is very, very robust, but for a very specific reason, right? So I highlighted and tabbed this one line right here where Don Quixote is speaking, "O lady of my soul, Dulcinea, flower of all beauty, Succor? This your knight who, through his desire to satisfy your great goddess, finds himself in this dire peril." So you can tell it's very dramatic when he speaks because he's this grand knight, right? But the rest of it is very easy language to understand, very humorous. I'm enjoying the tone, the character, the plot so far, as I said, that he's just kind of getting set up. And it was kind of sad because his niece and his housekeeper who live in the house with him think he's gone mad. So they call two of his friends to come and like burn all his books, which, oh, my little bookworm heart was just shattered at that. But it was interesting because you see the hypocrisy in that because they're going through to pick which ones need to be burned. And I think it's a reverend and a barber are his friends. And, you know, they have this righteous idea of morality and what should be burned. But then as they give their justifications for what not to burn, you can see they're very, very hypocritical. So even that was kind of humorous too, and very enlightening. So I'm enjoying this so far. I am looking forward to see what happens next. My initial vibe is that it is going to read like a bunch of short stories that, you know, he just comes upon these different tasks or situations where he sees he can assert himself as a knight in the honor of his lady, which really he just made up. He just like attributed this name to this woman he knows of, and he's like, that's gonna be who I'm doing all this stuff for. And it's just kind of humorous how he sees to different ways to assert himself. So it is reading kind of like short stories so far, but I mean, I'm only on page 70, so I'm gonna get back into it. I just finished the second part, which isn't that impressive. It wasn't that long. But Don Quixote and his squire have run into some like goat herders, and they hear this story about one of their buddies who was unalived because he was in love. It was an unrequited love, and it drove him mad. And so they're talking about this girl named Marcella who was the reason for their friend's destruction. And they're going to their friend's funeral, and they want Don Quixote to come with them. Well, when they're at this burial or this funeral, Marcella herself appears, and she gives a speech which knocked my socks off. It was so incredible and really interesting for this time period, I think, too. And I highlighted a section of it. I definitely wanted to read it to you because it was an amazing passage. So they are asking her why she's there, if she's there to torment them and kind of rub it in that she was the cause of this downfall. So many men love her because she's so beautiful, and they think she's so stuck up because she turns them all down. So she's talking about love and everything and how people finding each other attractive. Maybe one is not attractive, the other one is. And even if they are well matched as far as beauty goes, that doesn't mean the attraction is going to be mutual, because not all beauty inspires love. Some beauties delight the eye, but don't captivate the heart just as well, because if all beauty did inspire love and conquer hearts, people's affections would forever be wandering this way and that without knowing where to come to rest. There's an infinite number of beautiful people, so the affections would be infinite too. And according to what I've heard, true love can't be divided and must be voluntary, not forced on you. If this is so, as I believe it, why do you think I should be obliged to give in to you just because you say you love me dearly? Or else tell me this, if heaven had made me ugly instead of beautiful, would I have been right to complain about you not loving me? What's more, you must remember that I didn't choose this beauty of mine. Heaven gave it to me exactly as you see it, quite freely, without my asking for it or picking it. And just as the viper doesn't deserve to be blamed for her poison, even though she kills with it, because nature gave it to her, so I don't deserve to be blamed for being beautiful, because beauty in a virtuous woman is like a distant fire or a sharp sword, which don't burn or cut anyone who doesn't come too close. Honor and virtue are ornaments of the soul, and without them the body, even if it is beautiful, shouldn't seem beautiful. Well then, if chastity is one of the virtues that most embellish the soul and the body, why should the woman who's loved for her beauty lose her chastity by responding to the advances of the man who, merely for his own pleasure, employs all his strength and cunning to make her lose it? And that's just like part of her speech. Like, how is she to blame because she's beautiful? And just because she is doesn't mean that any man is entitled to have her. She's entitled to live alone in solitude as she wishes. And what is she supposed to do? Is she supposed to say yes to a man just because he wants her? And if she doesn't love him back, like that makes her a villain too. So she's like, what do you want me to do? So she gives this whole amazing speech, and she basically says, I just want to be left alone. I want to be in solitude. I want to herd my goats. I want to be in the mountains and be with nature. And some of the men are so moved by her speech that they go to follow her. And this is where Don Quixote is like amazing. Chivalry is not dead when it comes to him. Well, as we know, because he's kind of obsessed with it. But he sees this, and thinking it a good moment to make use of his chivalry by succoring a maiden in distress, cried in a ringing voice, and with his hand on the hilt of his sword, let no man of whatever estate or condition dare to follow the beautiful Marcella under pain of incurring my furious indignation. She has shown with clear and sufficient reasons that she bears little or no blame for Grisostomo's death, and that she is far from reciprocating the desires of any of her suitors, for which reason is right that instead of being pursued and persecuted, she should be honored and held in esteem by all good men, for she has shown that she is the only woman in the world who lives such a chaste life. So this shows, like, he has the best of intentions, and that is chivalry. Like, the woman said no. Listen to what she is saying. I wonder if that was considered like really progressive for the time, that whole speech that Marcella made, because it was amazing and like scary how it's relevant today, right? Like, you shouldn't have to smile just because a man says so. Like, your existence is not there to make their life beautiful. It was such a good speech, and I love Don Quixote for supporting her. I'm checking in with Don Quixote now that I have reached part 2 of the novel, and my annotations are going really well so far. I think I really nailed the themes and the things to tab. but maybe I underestimated it just a touch, because literally on every page, definitely every chapter, but almost every page, I could tab orange for insanity, because there's lots of it, and also the realist versus idealist. Those themes are very, very prevalent. And literature. The theme of literature is everywhere. Not necessarily blunt conversations about the value of literature, but representations of how Don Quixote is kind of taking what he's read and emulating it in his real life. As far as the plot, I was right. So Don Quixote has his squire, Sancho Panza, and they are going on adventures. Don Quixote wants to honor his lady Dulcinea by completing acts of chivalry. And really in the dynamic between Sancho Panza and Don Quixote, you see the theme of realist versus idealist, because Sancho Pancho is like the realist, and obviously Don Quixote is the idealist. And so their dynamic is hilarious. Their conversations are my favorite part, I think. Sancho Panza has joined Don Quixote on his quests because he's been promised to be like the master of his own island or castle. He's promised all these riches and status, and so he thinks Don Quixote is a knight that can get this stuff for him. And they go on these adventures, and this is where the insanity part comes in, because whatever Don Quixote sees, he sees it as something else. So windmills are giants. A bunch of criminals being transported by army guards are actually innocents that are trapped and need to be saved. A band of monks traveling on the road are actually fellow knights that he has to challenge and battle. And inns, every inn that he comes across is actually a castle. And anything that doesn't go according to his chivalrous mind, it's not because he's wrong, it's because the castle is enchanted. Duh. So there's a lot of insanity here. And it is kind of funny to watch these different adventures and how Sancho Panza starts off as like pure critical realist, but then it almost seems like he's starting to believe Don Quixote, which is really fascinating. So on their travels, they meet a bunch of other characters, as you can imagine. And the interesting part about the writing style is some of these characters that you meet branch off into their own subplots. And Don Quixote isn't even a part of it at times. Like sometimes they're at an inn and Don Quixote is sleeping and everybody else is having a conversation or telling stories. And that was kind of bugging me at first because I personally like a chronological linear plot, and so that was a little bit frustrating to me. Like, what's the point of this? But then what I did find fascinating is a lot of these subplots in the different chapters come together, and so I liked that. I liked seeing how everything came together, and I ended up really enjoying that aspect. There is a very interesting observation in part 1 that I picked up from lit charts that I would not have caught on my own. And lit chart says that people in chivalry books very rarely eat, drink, sleep, or perform any other basic bodily functions. Many people have thought that certain aspects of human life are too dull, repulsive, or animal to include in literature or history. But this novel is famous for helping to create a more inclusive kind of literature. So what's fascinating about that is Don Quixote doesn't think he needs to eat anything, because in the books that he's read, knights don't eat. They don't pee. They don't drink. Like, they're these superhuman things. So he's purposely not eating, even though he's starving, because he doesn't think knights need to. And that comes into play too with like medicine, with this like magic concoction that he has to like cure himself. And so it's kind of comical, but then you get that theme of literature through that, and insanity and idealism, like all wrapped into one. So many of these themes really intertwine. As far as the annotations, something else, if I were to do this over again, I'm not gonna start it now, but if I were to do it over again, I would definitely tab hypocrisy, because there is a lot of hypocrisy in this story, especially when it comes to his friends, the priest and the barber, who know that he's running amok and they want to bring him back. They think reading is stupid. They burn his books, right? But the hypocrisy in which they go through each of the books and how they determine this one's okay, this one's not, that hypocrisy really carries through in so many different elements of the story that I would have definitely liked to tab that. And hypocrisy kind of goes hand in hand with lying, which I think lit charts did call out as another potential theme, truth and lies. So I can definitely see that in here, but hypocrisy is one that I am finding very fascinating with some of our characters. So I recommend keeping an eye on that if you're going to read this and check for things to annotate. At this point, I have about half of the book left. This is part 2. It doesn't seem like part 2 is broken down into parts itself, like the first section was. I don't know what to expect. Anything that I knew of from Don Quixote was covered in part 1. So I have no idea what to expect, and lit charts did say that the book was originally supposed to end at the end of part 1, so part 2 was unplanned. So curious how that is going to play out, if we're gonna have more adventures. It seemed to like tie up very nicely at the end of part 1. So only one way to find out. I'm back after finishing part 2, or like the second volume of Don Quixote. And I know that might seem a little bit sudden because I didn't play any B-roll of me reading this and the bookish lifestyle stuff like I was planning to. But that's because I kind of gave up on annotating and I just listened to the audiobook for the second part. And there's a couple reasons for that. So jumping ahead a little bit, I did like the book. I would rate it 3.5 stars. And it was just a solid like. And that's because it was really hard for me to immerse myself in this book. I mentioned it kind of reads like a bunch of short stories, and we're introduced to these side characters and then they go off on their subplots. And so it kind of reminds me of like a TV series where each episode, maybe even like a sitcom, kind of like a sitcom because it was so humorous, but each episode of the TV series that is like a self-contained story and there's not too much of like an overarching plot of the whole series. So it's like after each episode you feel kind of satisfied and concluded, and there wasn't anything really pulling me to keep reading it, and I kind of just wanted to power through it. Again, not saying I didn't enjoy it, because I did, but it was just really hard to latch onto. Something I have not talked about yet is the narration style of Don Quixote. Cervantes made a very interesting choice with this book, and at times, particularly like in the prologues, but at various times throughout the novel, the narrator breaks the fourth wall and speaks to you, the reader. And not only are they speaking to you, the reader, but they're talking about the author of the book, like in this third person. So it's interesting, like this narrator is saying, oh, the author of this first part, you know, it's debatable if he stopped writing here and it was written, the rest was written by someone else. Very, very interesting how that was done. I really liked that. It made it extra quirky, extra unique. And the book is so self-aware. So in part 2, or volume 2, or part, whatever you want to call it, it does that thing again. But this part starts, it's like a month after part 1. So Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are back in their village, in their home, with the barber and the priest, and just spending some time with family. Who are trying to convince them, you know, that chivalry doesn't exist, knights don't exist, like get over your imaginations. And Sancho Panza comes to tell Don Quixote, guess what? Someone wrote a book about our adventures. Like everything in volume 1 is already written down in a book. And it was so meta, so self-aware, so interesting, the conversations. But he brings someone, Sancho Panza brings someone to Don Quixote to talk about this book. And I underlined this section that I wanted to tell you about on page 511. And does the author, Don Quixote asked, by any chance promise a second part? Yes, he does, Sanson replied. But he says he hasn't found it and doesn't know who's got it. So we can't tell whether it'll come out or not. And both because of this and because some people are saying second parts are never any good, and others are saying what's already been written about Don Quixote is quite enough. There are doubts about the appearance of this second part, although other people who are jovial rather than saturnine say, let's have more Quixotery and let Don Quixote charge and Sancho Panza talk. And that'll keep us happy, whatever he writes. And what's the author's position? He says, Sanson replied, that as soon as he does find the history, for which he's searching with the utmost diligence, he's going to have it printed immediately, more for the profit he can make out of it than to win anybody's praise. How funny. It's like, I bet you this is what Cervantes was experiencing. Like, people were asking him if there would be a part 2, but the fact that he like put it in the book as the characters discussing it, so hilarious and so brilliant. As I was reading part 2, it really felt like the book was about Don Quixote and his relationship to the story that was written about him. And the people that he's encountering out on the road, because of course he goes out on the road again as a knight, and so the people that he encounters claim to have read his story and know who he is, and same with Sancho Panza. So it takes a little bit of a twist with the characters they meet on the road, and that's kind of interesting. They meet this Duke and Duchess who I think are very mean-spirited because they like to play pranks on Don Quixote because they know that he's a little bit insane, and it feels mean. It feels really sad. I didn't necessarily like those guys. As these pranks and jokes continue kind of making fun of Don Quixote, he's kind of falling into a little bit of a depression, and so I feel like the second part took a much more somber tone. To me, it felt kind of sad. I mean, in some cases, these pranks, these mean-spirited pranks, gave Don Quixote an opportunity to actually fulfill his purpose and intention by helping people, and that I liked when that happened. But generally, Don Quixote is going a little bit downhill, and at the same time, Sancho Panza's luck is increasing, and his character development was very interesting because he's actually evolved with some wisdom. He has made some very wise actions. It was cool to see some things come to fruition for him, but he also had a lot of moments where he faced a lot of humiliation. So he has a lot of these moments of wisdom, but then a lot of these times where I feel like he was humiliated or made fun of. Not as, well, I guess still kind of mean-spirited as Don Quixote, but still just situations where he's kind of made fun of, and that was tough. But it stands true with the first part of the book that my favorite aspect of this is their friendship. And I love their conversations, the revelations they have. I love their banter, and I love what they individually represent and what's reflected. So again, idealism for Don Quixote and realism for Sancho Panza. So I love their interactions. It's what disenchanted me from the book was really these side characters that we meet and this feeling of just a bunch of short stories that, yes, they do intertwine, so it's not truly a collection of short stories, but there's not like an overarching linear plot that kept me turning the page. With Don Quixote's depression, he's also coming to terms with reality a little bit, and it's kind of like the death of his imagination. And I feel pretty down after finishing this. Just the direction that it went. And you know, it's headed that direction when Don Quixote comes up to an inn and he no longer calls it a castle. He calls it an inn. And he's like coming to terms with reality. And I don't know, I liked the humor, I liked the whimsy, I liked this silly knight getting into, you know, having the best of intentions and just causing more problems. And the tone really shifted to now I just feel kind of sad. Like, let this old man just have fun. Who cares? But I'm a little bit disappointed. And not in the book. You see what I'm saying? I still rated a 3.5, but I just don't feel uplifted and happy for something that was so goofy and like lighthearted for the rest of the read. It just got kind of like defeating at the end. So, you know, I'm really glad that I switched to the audio because you know, and the annotations actually were so good, and I would still think about these things while I was listening to it. But again, like the things I'm tabbing are so frequent. They're so frequent that I could tab every single page. So at this point, it didn't even give me as much satisfaction to annotate it because it just felt like, I mean, that's what the story is about. So, you know, the moments of insanity for Orange, it was just so, it was every single page. It was demonstrated or discussed, or there was symbolism with it. Intention and outcome was everywhere. realist, idealist was everywhere. Literature was a constant conversation. So all my annotation tabs were still incredibly relevant in the second part. I wasn't as engaged in the read, so I wasn't going to annotate it just for the sake of this video. I think you guys get the point. I think if you wanted to annotate it, you have a good sense of what you could do. So I'm glad that I read Don Quixote. I can absolutely respect it and understand why it's a classic and why it was considered so groundbreaking. I can see why it's a classic. It was fun for most of the read, but 1,000 pages of these like side quests and subplots was just too much for me. It's not, and I don't like collections of short stories. So if you are a reader who does like that kind of stuff, you might feel completely different about this. My rating is not a reflection on the book overall. It's a reflection of my enjoyment of it. And so I do think, like, a lot of people say this is their favorite book of all time or their favorite classic. I can see it. I can understand it. This book is brilliant for what it set out to do. And it was very entertaining and funny, and the themes were awesome. Characters were so charming and quirky. Really interesting to see the level of humor in a classic, in a book that was written such a long time ago. You never know what humor will translate to modern times, and this definitely stands the test of time. So that's my complicated review of it, but hopefully I gave you a good sense of the book and if it might be something that you could enjoy, and even if you wanted to annotate it, give you some ideas of how you can do so. So that is my classics reading vlog for Don Quixote. Thank you so much for hanging out with me in this reading vlog, and I will see you in the next one.